Can we talk about something that bugs me? I'm frustrated a little bit, so let's address it. Hey, everybody, I'm Jeff Hansen. We're back and we're talking BYU sports once again. BYU football 7-0, ranked number 11, coming off of another big win over Oklahoma State. And yet, feels like BYU fans feel really, really disrespected. And I get it. There's a lot of BYU fans that are frustrated by the national narrative. There's been lots of discussion about, well, what BYU's doing isn't repeatable. BYU, they're punching above their weight class. There's been all kinds of things. And BYU fans, to our credit, I don't know, to our detriment, we've taken it upon ourselves to call out, AP voters who still have BYU low, national shows. We're not ones to be shy when we feel like there is criticism or unwarranted disrespect about BYU football. I don't know what it is about BYU fans, but we do that. We look for those disrespectful things and we tend to call it out. Blame Governor Boggs. I don't know, but that's just who we are as BYU fans. I want to talk about some of it today because there is some narratives here that are happening at a national level that are frustrating. And I want to talk through really one of them specifically. And it has to do with the tone, I guess the conversation since BYU's win over Oklahoma State. Okay, let's relive the game against Oklahoma State. Look, BYU didn't play well, turned the ball over a few times. They certainly left points on the board. Hinckley Ropati throws that bad interception in the red zone. Jake Retzlaff gets away with a couple of interceptions. BYU still finds a way to win. They have to come back. It's a semi-miracle that BYU won, but they found a way to grit out a win anyways. That's great. That should be something great about the BYU football team. That they didn't play well, that they didn't have their fastball working, and yet they still found a way to win. That should be a positive. And yet it's not. I mean, it's being looked at as, BYU's about to be exposed. BYU got lucky. Here's the thing. I want to go through, let's just go back in time over some of the games that have happened, some of the biggest wins for BYU so far this season. We'll go all the way back to that SMU game. The narrative coming out of that game was that BYU was fortunate and lucky to win. It was 18-15. BYU's offense couldn't get out of their own way. They had 3 turnovers in that game, but BYU got lucky that SMU couldn't punch the ball into the end zone. I mean, that was the narrative. Nobody was impressed by that BYU win over SMU. There was a discussion about, SMU is not actually as good as we thought they would be. Now here we are a few weeks later. SMU is 6-1. They look like they are in cruise control to the ACC title game. And now SMU suddenly good again. But BYU's win over SMU, it was fluky. Doesn't count. There's no respect being given for BYU being the one team that was able to beat SMU. The Kansas State game. Kansas State, they were a perceived favorite in the Big 12 Conference, and they should be. Avery Johnson, DJ Giddens. It's a fantastic football team, and they are playing fantastic football. And maybe they do still end up in Arlington in the Big 12 championship game. Maybe they are the better team than BYU. But on that night, that Saturday night in Provo, BYU was the better team. They beat the doors off of Kansas State. But again, the narrative coming out of that game was those aren't repeatable things. BYU's offense had short fields. Can't depend on turnovers. A special teams touchdown. You can't depend on special teams happenings. And I get it. If I'm betting money in Las Vegas, you're looking for those repeatable things. But I saw a really good football team go up against another really good football team, and BYU got the best of them that night. Even the Baylor game the following week, BYU goes up 21-0 in the first 12 minutes of the game and then holds on to win on the road. They covered the spread. Everything was great. And yet BYU, it was the narrative coming out of that game was that BYU was lucky to hold on to that game. That aside from the first 12 minutes of the game, Baylor really outplayed BYU. There wasn't a lot of respect given. Okay, then Arizona comes. BYU plays a well-rounded game, and every facet of the game, BYU wins, and they, on a national stage, get a blowout win. That's great. Kind of goes unnoticed. It was a pretty big weekend, October 12th, pretty big college football weekend. That really stellar BYU performance flies under the radar, and now we come to Oklahoma State, and that comeback happens. Jake Retzlaff finds Darius Lassiter. BYU wins in the final seconds of the game. It was great. And now the discussion is, well, BYU was lucky to win the game. They aren't that good. Oklahoma State is mediocre. This is a regression to the mean for BYU. And it's frustrating. And let me tell you why I think that the narrative really, BYU's win over Oklahoma State, based on what the narrative has been out of these other wins so far, the national media should be more impressed with what BYU did against Oklahoma State than they have been all year long. If BYU was only beating SMU because they got lucky and had a few short fields, and because the defense got lucky to hold SMU to a few touchdowns or a few field goals and no touchdowns, that didn't happen for the defense against Oklahoma State. Okay, if BYU was lucky to beat Kansas State because there's no way you can depend on those turnovers and short fields and blah, 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 the offense didn't really have to do a whole lot against K-State. Well, they had to do a ton against Oklahoma State. BYU lost the turnover battle against Oklahoma State, and yet they still found a way to win. If what Kansas State, if that game was not repeatable for BYU, if that's not a game that commands respect, then how is winning when you don't have your best stuff, when all of the bounces don't go your way like it did against Oklahoma State, how is that not a positive? Shouldn't we be more optimistic about BYU that, hey, even when all the bounces don't go their way, even when they're not the team getting the big plays? And remember, Ollie Gordon popped off for a 50-yard touchdown run. Garrett Rangel had another 50-plus yard run in that game. It was Oklahoma State who was finding those big plays, those home runs. Those are the things that BYU is almost an indictment, because those things can't be repeated. But now BYU is being I don't know. Things are being held against BYU. Those plays are being held against BYU because other teams did them. But if they're really not repeatable, like we've seen or like we've heard all year long, then shouldn't BYU be commended for still winning? All the bounces went against Kansas State against BYU, and Kansas State got blown out. All the bounces went against Baylor early on, and yet Baylor didn't come back to win. All of the bounces went against SMU, except BYU still lost the turnover battle. I've never really understood that game. But the bounces didn't go SMU's way against BYU, and SMU lost. Okay, we can extend this beyond BYU's schedule. Vanderbilt, had a lot of really positive bounces go their way when they beat Alabama. Alabama's got 2 losses on the season, and they're still ranked. Notre Dame, the bounces didn't go their way against Northern Illinois, and they lost to a 2-loss MAC team at home. And yet they're still being given a ton of respect. I don't get what BYU has to do at this point, other than continue to win, and it's all going to sort itself out. But BYU didn't get the bounces against Oklahoma State. BYU didn't get the good luck. BYU didn't have to depend on those non-repeatable plays, and they still found a way to gut out a win. I mean, and yes, I'm a BYU guy, but I am more optimistic about BYU in the remaining 5 games of the season after the Oklahoma State game than I was after the Kansas State game. BYU could beat anybody. That Kansas State win was a bigger win for BYU, for the program. But that win against Oklahoma State showed me more about BYU, that even if their fastball's not working, they can come up with a bunch of other pitches and find a way to get creative and win a football game. That has been the condemnation about BYU so far, is that if things don't go their way, can they still win football games? They proved that they could against Oklahoma State. That should be the discussion about BYU right now, that even when things did not go their way, 38-35, they get a big win, big home win. It's a huge test against UCF. That Oklahoma State game showed a lot of things that BYU has got to work on. They've got to get better against the run, especially that read option game. Those defensive ends crashed hard, and there were not linebackers fitting the gaps behind them or filling the assignment and maintaining contain on the outside. Kalani talked about players playing hero ball. I don't know if he's talking about the ends or the linebackers, corners. I don't know who he's talking about, but very clearly there were players who were missing assignments, a ton of missed assignments against Oklahoma State. BYU didn't play well offensively. They turned the ball over 3 times. The play calling Trick plays on a first down in the red zone, probably not ideal. Jake Retzlaff has a couple of bad interceptions. That's not great. Okay. BYU has room to grow. They've got to clean those things up if they're going to beat UCF. But what I saw from BYU against Oklahoma State is a team that knows how to win. And at the end of the day, is that not what football is all about, is finding ways to win? Because there's a lot of teams across the country that have played ugly football and lost those games. There's a lot of teams across the country that have had the bounces go the opponent's way and lost games. But against Oklahoma State, BYU proved that they don't have to have the bounces go their way and they don't have to play perfect football. They could still win games. I'm more optimistic about BYU's future coming out of that Oklahoma State game than I have been all year. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. The narrative has been a little bit weird. I don't love it. Let's change the narrative. The only way BYU could change that narrative is by continuing to win football games. That starts on Saturday afternoon against UCF. Thanks, you guys. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. And until next time, give them hell. Go Cougs.